humanity and for an actual positive resolution of the such a complex set of conflicts that plague the world today?
Well, first of all, let me wish all our viewers a happy New Year, because, I think we should wish everybody not only a happy New Year, but a full New Year, which is not necessarily guaranteed given the state of affairs. I mean, this past year of 2025, people have expressed this many times, has been so tumultuous that, one could get the feeling almost every day a strategic, dramatic change would take place. People were completely shocked, and then the next thing would happen. Because, the year started, with the surprise victory of Donald Trump. He went into the White House in late January. And we should remember that later it became known that the Pentagon had an estimate by the end of the Biden administration that as a result of the US policy and European policy towards Ukraine, the probability of ending up in nuclear war was estimated 50%. And the fact that that was just taken, gives you a sense of, how absolutely reckless some of the elites have been. And what unfolded then, was a year full of strategic contradictions. On the one side, naturally, President Trump made a couple of significant changes. I think the most important of which was the Anchorage meeting, that he credibly expressed his desire to normalize relations with Russia. He moved away, one has to clearly state that, from the Wolfowitz doctrine, which had been persisted throughout the Biden administration, that the United States would insist on global dominance, including the possibility of having a first strike and win a tactical nuclear war. At least that was expressed by Admiral Buchanan in a meeting of the CSIS in November 2024. So later, when Trump issued, or in the Trump administration, the national security strategy was issued, that showed a clear break with that by not insisting in that way on the dominance of the United States anymore. But, if you look at the actual implication, it has not really changed that much, even if the main emphasis is now on the Western Hemisphere. But, if you look at the different crises, the Middle East, which is not moved away from the danger of a new war against Iran. We have now the new crisis between Japan and China, triggered really by Prime Minister Takaichi's remark about how a military intervention by the mainland China in Taiwan would represent an existential security interest for Japan. And naturally, you have the continuation of the Ukraine war by the coalition of the willing, an establishment which clearly has ties not to the United States. And, people in Europe at least thought for a long time that Europe has become the colony of the United States. With the arrival of President Trump in the White House, it became clear that is not a colony to the United States as a state, but to the permanent bureaucracy, and, or more correctly, the financial elite sitting in Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and the City of London. So the other major development of 25 was naturally that, and that's totally unacknowledged by the Western elites, if one can call them that, is the fact that we are experiencing an epochal change where the 500 years of colonialism clearly has come to an end. This was very much demonstrated by a series of events of the BRICS, but especially also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting end of August, beginning of September, including the incredibly impressive military parade at the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in the Pacific, demonstrated with a big, or celebrated with a big military parade in Beijing, where a lot of leaders of the Global South attended, and it just showed, that the world has completely changed. Now, the world has changed also because of the rise of China. And I want to show you a short clip, which is a very tiny excerpt of the New Year address from President Xi Jinping. And, the reality of what is behind that has been completely unacknowledged by the Western establishment. So let's see this clip.
上升最快的经济体之一，天问2号开启追星之旅，亚夏水电工程开工建设，首艘电磁弹射型航母正式入列，人形机器人亮出功夫模式，无人机演绎绚丽烟花，创新创造催生了新质生产力。也让生活更加多姿多彩。上升最快的经济体之一，天问2号开启追星之旅，亚夏水电工程开工建设，首艘电磁弹射型航母正式入列，人形机器人亮出功夫模式，无人机演绎绚丽烟花。
So this gives you a glimpse, and I can only encourage you to watch the entire speech, not only what Xi Jinping is saying, but when you see the footage which the TV team attached to his speech, it gives you a glimpse of the absolute transformation of China, which it accomplished in the last 40 years from a poor country to clearly the most modern and most powerful physical economy of the world today. And it demonstrates that, the policy of China building up its own physical economy, lifting 850 million people from poverty, and then extending that model through the Belt and Road Initiative as a way for the countries of the Global South to begin their own development, overcoming the colonial status, developing from raw material exporting countries into soon middle-level income countries, that model of cooperation and helping countries to overcome their underdevelopment obviously has proven to be so much more successful than the Western model of the liberal system trying to maintain superiority and control of the institutions, which clearly, is not functioning. So now we are confronted with a situation where, Asia as a whole is rising. It's not just China. There are other countries like India. The effort to pull India into the camp of the so-called democracies versus the autocracies also has not functioned. So you have now a close cooperation between Russia, China, India, but also Brazil, Indonesia, and many other countries of the global majority. And we are now in 2026. I think the key question will be, can we move the Western countries to understand that obviously the Chinese model is more successful? Why? Because they have resorted to the American system of physical economy of Alexander Hamilton, of the First and Second National Bank, of Friedrich List, of Henry C. Carey, and they have applied an economic theory which used to be that of every country which had a successful industrialization, starting with the American Young Republic, which is celebrating its 250th anniversary in this coming year. And that should be taken by anybody of goodwill as a reminder, not only in the United States itself, but across the world, to go back to the origins of the American Revolution, which was the first anti-colonial war of independence against the British Empire, to look why America was a beacon of liberty and a temple of hope for the whole world, and how the United States could possibly go back to a foreign policy as it was conducted by John Quincy Adams, whose very famous idea was, it is not the purpose of the United States to go abroad and chase monsters, but to work in an alliance with republics for the common good of all, as it is expressed in the American Constitution and the preface of that Constitution. So people of goodwill are called upon in 2026 to think, how can we get humanity off the edge of the abyss? Because we are still at the edge of the abyss. I mean, the recent issue of Foreign Affairs has another article reminding people of an earlier piece from 2024 about the return to the concept of a total war. And one can see that if you look at the rearming of Europe, the militarization of Japan, the effort to, chase China, Russia, Cuba, Iran out of Latin America with the new NSS doctrine of the United States, the situation in the Middle East, we are not very far away from the potential that any one of these crisis points could develop into a global nuclear war, which would extinct humanity. And therefore, I think that the biggest task, everybody who wants to have peace, and Pope Leo XIV has made some very, very important interventions in this respect, saying that only peace is holy, and he, completely attacked the idea of conflict resolution with war. And very importantly, he introduced the method of Nicolaus of Cusa and his coincidence of opposites as the way of conflict resolution, which I think is of the highest strategic importance, because he applied it to the present situation by saying that that method of thinking by Nicolaus of Cusa is a way of putting things together which otherwise would not get in a coherent way united. So therefore, I think what we have to really put as a challenge for 2026, people of goodwill should do everything possible to avoid the danger of the extinction of civilization, which is the most important issue, because if that happens, everything else will be mute, and that we move to a new security and development architecture, which this time must take into account the interest of every single country on the planet to work in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia and in cohesion with what President Xi Jinping has called for with the Global Governance Initiative. So I think that that sets our task, and I call on all of you to work with the Schiller Institute to help us to accomplish that.
Helga, what's happening today is that various media outlets and others are putting forward their view of what the most important events were of 2025. And I noticed two contrasting such lists. The first would be the one from the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm not going to indicate every one of their top 10 events as they gave them, but I'm going to contrast this to a different list, which was put out by Xinhua, news agency of China. So the Council on Foreign Relations says, I'll just read the top 5 events of their 10 list, that number 1, Donald Trump disrupts U.S. foreign policy. We'll say a little bit about that a little later, what they have to say about that. Number 2, China weaponizes rare earth minerals. Number 3, Israel and the United States attack Iran's nuclear facilities. Number 4, the war in Ukraine grinds on. And number 5, the United States brokers a Gaza peace plan. So all of their top 5 are all about war, as you can see here, with a peculiar number 1 denouncing Donald Trump for disrupting U.S. foreign policy. Xinhua has the following. Number 1, China's head of state's diplomacy advances the cause of peace and development. And that just details some of the things that Xi Jinping did, the various meetings he attended, and trips to Southwest to Russia, South Korea, and other meetings. Number 2, US initiated tariff war severely impacts multilateral trade system. Number 3, international community marks 80th anniversary of World War II victory. Number 4, explosive AI development requires strengthened governance. And then number 5, global market turbulence intensifies economic risks. So I'd like to ask you, what do you think is they're so different. It's like two different worlds. What's your comment about this?
Well, I think what these two different lists reflect is the completely different idea of the image of man underlying what what they think is important and not. I mean, people probably have noticed, that it is sometimes puzzling how two people or more people interpret a very same event completely differently, so that you end up in such a result that you think it's two different universes. And when you scratch on the surface and look at the axioms on which their thinking is based, it always can be reduced to the image of man they have. In the case of the Council of Foreign Relations, it is very clear that they have an image of, basically what I said before, keeping control, keeping, the world in line with, what the axioms of originally the Wolfowitz doctrine was. Now it has modified a little bit, but, it just takes different forms. But keep control, keep the privilege of a leading class, which, one can say a lot about because that's emerging and going through a transformation right now. But, that is one set, an oligarchical outlook. The Chinese way on the other side, and you can look at each point, each of these points is motivated by an image of men where, you don't have this exaggerated liberalism, which we find in the West, but you have the priority of the common good of the people, not only the China country itself, the state of China is itself, but also the community of countries, and therefore they would put completely different priorities. And I think that is, people are always talking about a systemic threat coming from China. Well, you can say that the systemic threat is that it may turn out that model, which puts the image of man as, basically the most important purpose of politics, the improvement of the living standard, the happiness of the people, if you put that first, then naturally that may be more appealing to people. And so the threat comes not from a war threat, it comes from the threat of being good. And it may be that this perspective, which appeals to the improvement of the living standard and the well-being of people, is becoming more attractive, and that the systemic threat is that. So if people start to think about that, maybe they would feel inclined that we may have to go back to the better traditions of the West, which you had, for example, not only with the founding fathers in the United States, you had it with Lincoln, you had it with FDR, you had it with Kennedy. In Europe, you had it with Charles de Gaulle, you had it with various people in the post-war period in Germany, Enrico Mattei, Konrad Adenauer, Helmut Schmidt, always, not perfect, but in the positive direction. So I think we have to really reflect on the fact that we are in an unprecedented crisis, but so far the Western elites have been completely unwilling to look into the reasons why that is, and that the present constellation in the world is entirely their own doing. It's a blowback of their own policies. And if we want to remedy it, we all have to go to the best traditions of our histories in Europe and in the United States, and then just look for a cooperation instead of confrontation with the countries of the global majority. So I think that, people should reflect that, because these two lists you are referencing give you an insight into the mindset of those who made up this list.
Yes, I'll just indicate otherwise, Helga, just to read the other ones from the Council on Foreign Relations, because they've only got one that I think is not about war. 6 is Sudan's grueling civil war continues. 7, the AI race intensifies, which is actually also a part of the war idea. 8, India and Pakistan clash. And then number 10 is Cambodia and Thailand clash. So the only one they have that's not war is Cardinal Robert Prevost becomes Pope Leo the 14th. So maybe we can make a comment, actually, the fact that the Pope managed to make it on the list. This, of course, is the first American Pope in history. But the Pope also did something important this year on October 25th when he brought up a figure that you're very fond of and very important as a whole to your whole idea of a security and development architecture, Nicholas of Cusa. Could you say something to us about what you think is the importance of what this Pope represents, what he's been doing, and how that shift that happened this year is affecting the world community at this point?
Well, from what I can see is that, the thinking of Pope Leo the 14th is very much in tune with Nicolaus of Cusa. I think, while I have not yet listened to so many sermons and speeches by him, I think he has appealed to unity in the Curia. That's very important. He has again and again emphasized the need to have peaceful cooperation. I mean, that has been done by previous popes, but I think especially the speech he gave at the occasion of the Jubilee year, where he evoked Nicolaus of Cusa and his method of the coincidence of opposite applied to the present time. That's extremely important because, they were, given the long history of the significance of Nicolaus of Cusa, who had been put on the index by the Council of Trent, for example, and therefore was not known for many centuries in the academic world and among monasteries and so forth. Now there has been a renaissance more in the recent years, and people have recognized the outstanding importance of Cusa, who was for sure the most important thinker of the 15th century, at least in the Western world. And, he has provided a method where, it's a rejection of Aristotle and the Aristotelian method, which always goes by the contradiction, the contradictions which never can be overcome. And, that's naturally the Aristotelian thinking, what leads people to think that there is geopolitics, that you always have to have an enemy, that you never can come to a resolution. And Nicolaus rejected that, and he developed this idea, interestingly enough, in a period where, there was a clash of civilization. Constantinople was taken over a little bit later, but he also wrote De Pace Fidei, which is based about faith in religion, about peace in religion, in that mindset of the coincidence of opposite, basically refuting the idea of religious war, refuting the idea of violent resolution of conflicts by appealing to the ability of the human mind to always think the higher one, which overcomes the contradictions on the lower level. Now, it happens to be that Albert Einstein said the same thing later on. He said, you can never find a solution to a problem on the level where the problem arose, but you always have to think the higher unity. And that is exactly a method which has to be applied today, because if we do not overcome geopolitics, which is, as I said, based on an Aristotelian approach, and transform our thinking to the idea of thinking the one humanity first, we will not live, because in the time of nuclear weapon, the idea of war as a means of conflict resolution will doom us as a civilization. And it does put the civilizational challenge to all of us that we have to start thinking the one humanity first, and then you can have a legitimate interest of your country, but that interest of your country cannot ever be in contradiction to the interest of the one humanity. So we are civilization, and if you think in terms of the long-term history, we are at the point where we have to make a jump in our thinking to think the one humanity. And that jump has to be as dramatic as the overcoming of the Middle Ages and the axioms of scholasticism, witchcraft, all kinds of superstitions, to the modern age, which was accomplished through the thinking of Nicolaus of Cus and the Italian Golden Renaissance. And we are now, good 600 years later, almost 600 years later, at a point where we have to make the intellectual jump to the new era of civilization as a requirement for our own survival. And I find this extremely interesting that the Pope puts his intellectual and moral weight into this debate in this way. And one could only hope that, given the fact that he is an American, that it would have a big impact among Catholics and other religious leaders, but also the US president.
Helga, in the last 3 or 4 days, there's been a dramatic event, the attack on the residence of President Putin, even as the peace negotiations were going on at Mar-a-Lago, and phone calls were going on between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and then various discussions that were happening in Florida. Now, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, issued a statement in which he stated the following: the incident has reaffirmed the terrorist nature of the group of individuals who are unlawfully holding power in Kiev. He called out those in the EU and NATO, quote, who loudly demand ironclad guarantees for Ukraine's security as part of the negotiated settlement process led by Russia and the United States. He said there is no doubt that the main goal of Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and London is to preserve the regime that dreams of being helped to survive. And then he had a pretty sharp statement. He said, I am confident that the racist nature of the Kiev regime and the cynicism of its international sponsors can be clearly seen by conscientious members of the international community who cannot fail to understand that without the cessation of this criminal policy, negotiations aimed at achieving a reliable and durable settlement of the Ukrainian crisis will not succeed. I think it's been notable, and we've talked often on your webcast about how, on the one hand, you have the process that happened up in Anchorage, Alaska on August 15th between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And then you have this process that's happening around things like this Mar-a-Lago incident and how Russia has been caused to have to respond. And I wonder, given the talk you've had much about the coincidence of opposites, you've tried to emphasize to people that there are often these situations which are complex, they're very difficult. And so in looking at this recent exchange and this recent incident, I wanted to get your sense of what this means, what it implies, and what needs to be done going forward from here.
Well, I think it is quite amazing because the Russians put out the statement that there was this attack on Putin's residence. 91 drones were defeated, that they could knock them out, so they didn't do any damage. But it was an attempt on Putin's life. Now Trump was asked about that, and he said, yeah, I got the news from President Putin, and I don't like it, and so forth. But almost all the Western media and many Western politicians basically immediately said, oh, this is just Russian propaganda, it didn't happen, where is the proof? Now, this is insane. I mean, you have, first of all, to attempt to kill the commander of the strongest nuclear power in the world is an utmost act of war. It's a casus belli. If they would have succeeded, just think about it for a moment. Where would the world be if they would actually have killed Putin? we would be in a super crisis, and maybe not anymore because it could have exploded into a large nuclear war. The former advisor of Zelenskyy, Arestovich, he said that he thinks that the reason why that particular residence in Novgorod in Valdai was targeted is because there's also a nuclear command center, and that maybe there was some dimension to it whereby Putin would have been in that command center, and that was the target, which would make it even worse. But the fact that the Western media is dismissing it like that, condoning, obviously, what is an act of state terrorism, which implies the danger of a complete escalation. I mean, it just shows you that the sense of reality of the Western media, controlled naturally by their elites, is completely detached from reality. So what that means is, I think that people must really, first of all, I think the Russians have, in the meantime, provided a video where they show all kinds of damage which were caused by these drones. They show the flight routes of these drones. They locate where they were sent from, and I'm sure that more so-called proof will be provided. But I think it makes very, very clear that if we do not really, the populations of the Western countries have to impress on their leaderships that this cannot be tolerated anymore, and there must be a change in course towards cooperation, and then any problem in the world can be solved. Now, I think that is something which the people have to take up. We are now in 26. The US will probably go to install the US medium-range missiles in Germany. These are all systems which some of them have a range of more than 2,000 kilometers, reaching deep into the territory of Russia. That means we are in a situation like in the middle-range missile crisis at the beginning of the 80s. The only difference was then you had hundreds of thousands of people in the streets because they knew we were on the verge of World War III. And this time, people are dormant, people are complacent, people are, influenced by the NATO narrative to such an extent that they don't even perceive the dangers anymore in which they are. And we have to really do everything we can to strengthen the, courage of people to speak out, because if this thing is not stopped, we may not have a civilization very soon.
Also, Helga, was notable that this year at different times that President Vladimir Putin introduced an idea which he talked about as being not unipolarity, not multipolarity, but polyphony. And the idea that if there was going to be a new security and development architecture, you were going to have much more of, if you will, an orchestral or choral approach rather than soloists. And he made sort of this musical analogy about, those are all sort of soloing, they're not on the score. They're going to have to learn that that's not the way to actually produce harmony in the world community. I wanted to know if you had any comment about his introduction of that, because it was also sort of picked up by others. Xi Jinping had another version of it, and I think others, including you, had some comments about that.
Well, I actually used a similar conception many years ago when I did the work on Nikolaus of Cusa, because Nikolaus of Cusa had this idea that harmony in the macrocosm can only exist if you have the best possible development of all microcosms, and you can replace microcosm with nations and macrocosm the whole world. So Cusa argued that only if you develop every microcosm, and every microcosm regards it as its self-interest, to have the other microcosms develop in their best possible way, and vice versa, that this joint development is like a contrapuntal fugue, where the development of one nation furthers and improves the development of the other one, and that the whole thing is, working together like a polyphonic symphony. But that idea of a division of labor in the world, that is the only way how you can imagine a peaceful future. I mean, we are. It's so good that we are different nations. We have different cultures, different civilizations, different languages, different poetry, different traditions. But all of them, including our different economic circumstances, some countries are large, others are small, some have, special raw materials, others don't. But altogether, we are a family of nations, and it only works if there is a division of labor where the potential of every nation is being furthered in the best possible way, and that each of them brings in their contribution, like in a polyphony where each instrument contributes to the larger conception of the composition. And that's a beautiful image of how I can imagine the future of humanity can look like. And it's so much better to have that kind of harmonious development based on the equality of each, rather than one who is just, giving the tone and everybody else has to march in lockstep. I think that's a model which for sure has not worked so well.
Yeah, Helga, we got a question this was from Kynan. He was asking this: what would you say were the most significant achievements of the 3 conferences of the Schiller Institute in the U.S., Berlin, and Paris? I was personally inspired by the ensemble of speakers that were assembled, such as Naledi Pandor, Zhang Weiwei, and many, many others, representing he calls it the better nature of the West. What should people take away from this process?
Well, first of all, that we always design our conferences as a one. We have it's not specific academic issues, but we try to represent the strategic picture, to locate where we are in the world. Then we have always something on economic solutions, how to overcome problems. We always have a big panel on science, on the breaking developments in breakthroughs in the most advanced sciences, and very important always the dialogue of civilizations, bringing forward the best traditions. But the whole thing is composed as a one, and we are trying to get speakers from 5 continents to represent how such a cooperation would function. And in that way, if you take the 3 conferences, New Jersey, Berlin, and Paris, it shows you the absolute model of how easy it would be, really a piece of cake, to put the world in order. And that's a method we have learned from my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, who, those of us, and I know, Dennis, you are one of the earlier members of this movement, when you met with Lynn, you would always talk to him, and you could come into the meeting in the most disgruntled shape of mind, and then you would have a conversation with Lyndon LaRouche, and you would go out of this meeting and say, he put the world back in order and everything is coherent again, and you can actually make sense out of it. And I think that is sort of what we are trying to do with these conferences, because the effect is always that people meet people from Africa, from China, from Russia, from the United States, top experts in their field, and they come out of this meeting and they always say, look, it would be so easy to get reasonable relations among all of these nations, because we have just demonstrated it. And I think naturally the ice on the cake this time was the Paris conference, where we had a lot of young people who demonstrated that principle in the most joyful way, because they're just full of energy and want to make a better world. And that's why we are in the process of building an international youth movement, where if you are listening to this discussion right now and find this idea attractive, contact us, because I'm absolutely certain that 26 if we manage to get a powerful youth movement internationally, it can become the most important factor to move the world from the abyss of the danger we are at now, because young people have a right to determine the future because it's theirs.
You know, Helga, as we go to the close, I wanted to also note of course, the British were going to show up with their own list of things, the world in brief. But there's one article in particular I thought I'd like to get a comment from you about. It's called A Divided America Celebrates Its 250th Birthday. And I'm going to read this partially because it will make, I think, many of our American viewers appropriately angry, but it will give you also a chance to, I think, address this matter, which of course is now going to be, this is the 250th anniversary of the birth of the country. So here's what the London Economist had to say. Donald Trump may not be the most literary of men, but he hit upon the perfect metaphor when he proclaimed that he would mark America's 250th birthday by hosting a brawl on the White House lawn. The coming year will feature plenty of parades, fireworks, and commemorative events. Yet the octagon cage to be erected on the South Lawn ahead of the 4th of July and the Ultimate Fighting Championship, this is actually true, bruisers who will grapple within it, will best represent the state of American society, at least as channeled through its politics. Two rival national commissions are planning events. In 2016, Congress created the America 250 Commission, goes through what that is, says it's, Democrats and Republicans, and its honorary co-chairs are the Obamas and the Bushes. However, on returning to office, Mr. Trump issued an executive order establishing his own Task Force 250. And it goes on what that is. Chair, leadership, so forth. How the two commissions will coordinate remains unclear. Will Mr. Trump's task force promote the exhibition about George Washington's history of slavery planned at his Mount Vernon estate? Will it embrace the decolonization and LGBTQ inclusive guidelines proposed by the other task force? The past has become a partisan battleground in America. Now, there's more there, but I will spare all of us having to hear it. But there is something very serious about what is happening now in America around the 250th. I know you have ideas about it, and I think I'd like you to share those with us, and then as we go to a conclusion, if there's anything else we'd like to say. But please comment.
Well, I think, I think the present world and what you are reporting about these two approaches, or actually three approaches, reflects a fact that, the image of man has been forgotten. I mean, I think there is a danger of a new fascism in the world. And, it has some elements of the old fascism, militarization, Schachtian economics, austerity for the people. But there is a new element in it, and that I think is reflected by the writings of some people who shamelessly advertise that it's not a bad thing to accumulate as much wealth as you can. And it's now I'm adding this, you can turn from a billionaire into a trillionaire, and that gives you all the right to do what you want. And I think it's this unashamed idea that the privileges of a few are supposed what determines the fate of humanity. That's such a, I would say, it's like a cancer. It grows, it grows, and eventually it replaces the healthy cells in the body. But when the cancer takes over, the patient is dead. And it's these kinds of ideas which are so absolutely dehumanized that if we don't replace them, I think that means the end of America as a republic which unfortunately it is right now already. It's no longer a true republic. And I think, the chance to use the 250th anniversary to go back to the original idea, what was America supposed to be? You have to go back to Toscanelli, who invented the maps of Columbus. You have to reconstruct the entire effort, which, in a certain sense is beautifully expressed in Dvorak's symphony about the New World, which I think, we should play that particular composition throughout the year, because it gives you, when you listen to this music, it picks you up wherever you are, and it gives you the hopeful vision of what the American dream was supposed to be. So my immediate request to all of you is listen to Dvorak's New World Symphony to get a metaphor of what I'm talking about. Because if you look what America was supposed to be, it was a rejection of the oligarchy of Europe at the time of the American War of Independence. And it's a complete rejection of the British Empire. And the tragedy of the United States has been that in the following centuries, America was subverted by that very same ideology of the British Empire. They tried it first in 1812 militarily. They tried it again. The British Empire trying to undo the American Revolution and turning it back into a colony. They tried it for sure in the in the Civil War, where the British Empire allied with the Confederacy. They realized that militarily it could not be won, and practically after that, the various British institutions like the Fabian Society, Milner's Kindergarten, and various other such efforts tried to subvert the American establishment by convincing them that they should adopt the model of the British Empire to run the world based on an unipolar conception, based on the Anglo-American special relationship. And that has been the basis for the Wolfowitz doctrine. That has been the reason why the great chance of the end of the Cold War was not used, because rather than building a new peace order for the 21st century, the neocons started to implement exactly that idea of an unipolar control of the world, which clearly didn't work and backfired. I mean, Francis Fukuyama will go into history as having made the most short-lived wrong analysis when he proclaimed the end of history, because obviously this was the idea that the whole world would take over the model of the British liberal economic system, which caused this incredible blowback, what we have seen with the revolt by the global south. So now we have a situation, where President Trump, sort of, responds to an impulse in the American population with the MAGA movement and so forth. But I think it completely falls short of the beauty of what the American founding fathers were discussing. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, who based his entire ethics on Confucian philosophy. That is something very little known, but that would be a way of reaching out to China and recognizing that the ideas of Benjamin Franklin and the Chinese model are so similar, and that a dialogue is possible. So I can only say these two approaches are, like, for example, many years ago, you had Marian Anderson singing the national anthem beautifully. I mean, beautifully. Listen to that. Go to the YouTube. Listen to Marian Anderson singing the national anthem. And then Obama had Beyonce singing the same thing, Hollywood style, naturally flashy and so forth. But compare these two performances of the national anthem by Beyonce and by Marian Anderson. And then you get a sense of where the true soul of America is and where we have to bring America back. So that is my comment.
Helga, as we were beginning to assemble today's show, we got the tragic news that one of the founding members of the LaRouche organization, Anita Gallagher, had passed away. For people that would not, of course, know, she and her husband, Paul Gallagher, were two of the people, among others, several others, who found themselves on the most brutal receiving end of the armed might of the state, as they call it, and went to jail together with Lyndon LaRouche, her husband, during 1989. Um, Anita and Paul both are founding members of the Orleans Association. But, at the end of a year like this, and for a lot of people all over the world, in all countries, who have lost people, lost loved ones in many different ways, whether that be on a battlefield or it be just because of disease and so forth, it's often hard, or at least important, to reference, what is the significance of human life. Your husband, Lyndon LaRouche, wrote an article called "The Historical Individual," in which he talked quite a bit about this. And I know we all think about him, and we think about many others at these kinds of times. And I just wonder, it being the last day of the year and a kind of final time for people to reflect on the meaning of human life. Um, I know you knew Anita as well. And sometimes it helps people who view shows like this just to hear um, why it is that individuals who go through all sorts of suffering for higher purposes, why is it that is never in vain? What is it that makes them precious, and what is it that makes those efforts so important to humanity as a whole?
Well, I knew Anita, and actually, I visited Anita and Paul when they were in jail, and inhumanly, they were for a very long time there and separate. And for a loving couple to be separate in jail for many years is a form of torture, which is really unbelievably brutal and despicable. Because they were innocent completely. They did not do anything other than opposing the oligarchy in the United States and being, in absolute agreement with the ideas of my late husband. Anita was a true beautiful soul and a warrior angel, and witty. She had an incredible sense of humor, and she, by being a beautiful soul, she would impact many people around her, and that is how humanity lives on. I absolutely agree with Moses Mendelssohn, who, and Nicolaus of Cues in particular, said, the fact that the soul is creating things which are immortal means the human soul, which is of a higher order than that which it is creates, is immortal as well. So, it is the contribution of the life of such extraordinary individuals like Anita which brings humanity forward. And I think that is the most important you can do with your life, that you commit yourself to bring humanity a step further, because that is what lives on in all of us. And I want to express my fullest condolences to Paul.
Thank you, Helga. I think that's a beautiful way to end today's webcast and to end this year. And I want to extend Happy New Year greetings to you and everyone. And I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for supporting us throughout this year. And we'll see you next year.
And let's make that the success of humanity 2026.